That's not an immigration problem. That's a national security problem. But by not having a good immigration problem, we've made it impossible for the national security folks to do anything on the southern border, because those ones or twos are now swarmed by tens of thousands of people who we could put into buckets. And if we did put them into buckets, then the ones and the twos would much more strongly stand out.
Yeah. You talked about economics. You talked about security. The last space was kind of, is it the social and cultural? Is
Sure.
that what you
And,
were?
honestly, I think most of the people are opposed to immigration. That's what they're thinking of even more than security. They may say security, but what they really mean is, I don't want that person here. Uh, Cultural change is hard. And the single largest voting bloc we have, the baby boomers, are now majority retired. And when you retire, you get a little crotchety. So it makes sense for me. We've seen this in Europe too, that as populations age past that point, they become a lot more ossified when talking about border issues. But the argument you have to make to these people is, do you want health care when you retire? Because there aren't enough people in the country anymore to do it for you. So if you want to die alone in your house or be a burden on your family, then yeah, a closed border sounds like a great idea. But if you want some help, you got to bring it in.
Interesting. Yeah, I've never even thought of it that way. You know, I grew up in Los Angeles in the, every culture you can think of. I never really
Yeah.
was race wasn't a big thing. Then I went to the military and we made fun of each other's races. And again,
Sure.
no one cared. Just go to war. I don't care who you are as long as you got my back. As I got older, then I started to see how race started really playing a significant role, and it was surprising to me. Right now I've seen many different cultures come across, and people are more nervous about it because of their lack of, experience around other cultures.
Yeah, I
I
mean,
was raised
it's
on.
easy for me, as someone who has lived in Texas for 19 years, has had more of that experience, to be relatively welcoming, especially for the Hispanic influx. But, not maybe a third of Americans have never really functionally left their home state except for maybe for a vacation. And immigrants until recently have clustered in certain parts of the country. What we're seeing now in, say, the American South is different. This is an area that is aging relatively quickly. This is an area that can't resuscitate its own labor market without a lot of help. And while they are perfectly willing to take, say, Midwesterners coming in, foreigners coming in tilts things a different direction. And that's a bit of a problem for everyone.
Is there ever a fear that you've mentioned a couple times when immigrants come across, they have to kind of conform to our rule of law? Is there ever a fear that too much of an influx and people don't want to assimilate, they don't want to kind of support the system, and that kind of slowly destabilizes our own country?
That's the Canada problem. So in Canada, they have a much wider open door, but they allow, and even to a degree encourage, everyone who's coming in from a certain country or certain ethnic group to move to where that ethnic group already has a bit of a concentration. And so you've got a little Sikh, you've got a little Taliban, and on and on and on around Toronto. And you have ultimately multi-generational ghettos that never really assimilate. We don't have that really in our experience. In fact, if you look at first generation migrants versus second generation American citizens, the fastest disappearing language in the United States is Spanish. Yeah, they assimilate very quickly. Now that's going to be different group to group and region to region. I'd say the Hmong of the St. Paul area are probably on the far side of kind of retaining their culture, because they almost got genocided where they came from, and they're trying to preserve some of it. But as a rule, if you can wait a generation, the language that is imported largely disappears. A lot of the cultural stuff gets sanded down very quickly. America is the best country in human history for doing that. But it takes a generation, and if you're already 60, you're not going to live to see that. I can
Yeah,
understand why it's spooky.
in my own household, I wasn't raised speaking Spanish, but my parents spoke Spanish to each other.
Uh-huh.
I never taught my kids Spanish because I didn't really know Spanish. My wife understands Spanish fluently but doesn't speak it. And so now we're in an era where I'm trying to teach my younger kids Spanish because I'm like, no, trust me, you need this.
You're a bunch of gringos.
Yeah, they call us no sabos, or they call it coconuts, everything you can think of.
Mm-hmm.
But the one thing we uphold in our house is still our culture by cooking, the
Mm-hmm.
music, the different different cultural things that I've retained from my mother, my grandparents, and my wife as well. But it's fascinating to think that could this country be destabilized because of the lack of assimilation?
If you look at the settler states, and there's four of us: Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand. Those four. That has not proven true. And we are not the country that has had the biggest immigration surge. The danger with the way we handle migration is we ebb and flow. And so like right now we're having a nativist moment, but if you go back 20 years, we were having a very internationalist moment. And so we get these big surges and then we take a break and then another big surge. And it guarantees that we're always going to have this shock. And then we dial back and then we're like, oh, we're okay. And then we have another shock. Whereas in, say, like New Zealand, it's a lot more regular. Granted, you can't walk to New Zealand, but it becomes more of a steady trickle. Cultures change, cultures evolve, and people coming in and joining the culture are one of many ways that those evolutions can happen. But there's always going to be people who want it to go faster, and there's always going to be people who want it to go slower. And you know what we call that? Politics.
Crazy. Any final thoughts? I honestly have been enlightened this whole time. I know I love it. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, two. Number one, we're going to be okay. We've been through this before. We'll get through this again. And then second, the next big wave of migration probably isn't going to be from the southern border. That's not because I think Congress is going to magically fix all these things, although I do have some hopes for the next couple of Congresses as our political situation continues to evolve. But we're looking at a lot of countries around the world breaking over the next 10 years, unless something really dramatic changes. And that includes China, and that includes Germany. And so we're going to be having a surge of people around the world with portable degrees and a suitcase full of cash looking for a place to land. And you mentioned earlier the non-Hispanic ethnicities that had started to come across the border. We're seeing the very early stages of that. But it's going to be the greatest flow of skilled labor in the history of the world. We're talking about probably upwards of 250 million people trying to find a new home. And we're going to get as many of them as we're willing to take.